I'm Chris Levesque, and I'm the president and CEO of TerraPower. I got my undergraduate degree through the Navy ROTC program, and we basically had to decide, do we want to go be on surface ships, the gray things on top of the water, fly planes, be a U.S. Marine, or be a submarine officer. And during my 4 years of undergraduate work, I had the chance to meet quite a few submariners, kind of identified with them, and actually learned more about nuclear energy and thought it was pretty cool. So I interviewed to enter the Navy nuclear program in Washington and got accepted. So once I got my bachelor's degree, they sent us for about a year of nuclear training and then several months of submarine officer school as well, where we learned how to shoot torpedoes and things like that. And then I was on a submarine at a pretty young age, supervising a reactor with a young crew. I think I was about 23 or so, and was supervising some really young, smart people who were 19. And of course, this was in the late 80s, early 90s. So unfortunately, it was just men at that time, but it's really great. There's now women on submarines too, doing all these really interesting jobs. Our modern grid, which has been around for decades, is really a miracle that we take for granted. Think about the amount of times during the day in our homes or in industry where we change the demand on that system, and we just count on the electrons being there, right? When we flip the switch, and that's one, because it's a great system, but two, we haven't stressed it too much in the last decades. We've had pretty flat electricity demand growth as we moved from a manufacturing economy to a service economy in the U.S., and we've implemented a lot of efficiencies like LED lighting. But in the coming decades, we're really going to stress the grid even more, because as we electrify transportation with electric vehicles, as we electrify the industrial sector to try and have things like steel production use less fossil fuels, that means we're going to double electricity demand between now and 2050 in developed grids like the U.S. and Europe and Asia. At the same time, doubling this demand, we're going to shut off all of this fossil power, which we really relied on 24/7. And we're adding a lot of wind and solar, which is great because it's emission-free. But we have to remember that wind and solar are intermittent and they can change throughout the day. So when you think at system level, that means if you're retiring all of that coal, you need to make sure you're replacing it with something that's running 24/7 to kind of support the wind and the solar that's kind of coming and going throughout the day. So nuclear becomes a really important part of the mix there. And there's multiple studies now that are showing that if you're going to have a totally carbon-free grid, it should be 20 to 30% nuclear. When the U.S. built the 100 nuclear power plants, it was kind of a painful process. We made those projects take longer than they should have, only to find out when they were finally delivered, they were really efficient and have been powering 20% of our grid now for decades. And that whole experience, I think, caused us to be more risk-averse and not to want to continue evolving the technology. So it turns out that most of the plants in the U.S. are 1970s technology or before, and even some of the new reactors being considered are not really advanced technology. They're kind of smaller versions of the existing technology. So there's really a need to innovate in nuclear energy, and TerraPower was really founded around this idea of the need for innovation in nuclear science. It's kind of a field of science that, because of stigma and because of some bad experiences in the 70s, a lot of people said, well, let's just put this whole field of science in the corner. I mean, and that makes no sense, right? With the challenges we have with climate and energy and even human health, we really need to be moving forward in nuclear science. First, even the plants that are 40 or 50 years old are super safe. Many of them were approved for initial 40 years of operation by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and quite a few have already gone through a life extension to take them to 60 years. So even though those are older technology, we absolutely need to keep those on the grid. But it's really time now to advance the technology and bring advanced nuclear. Now, it's really important that we realize the power density of nuclear energy. One fuel pellet for even today's nuclear reactors is equivalent to tons of coal, for example. Nuclear fuel is millions of times more power dense than hydrocarbons, which hydrocarbons are actually a very dense fuel and, an amazing fuel source over the last 100 years. But nuclear energy has this attribute of density. It has dense fuel. It also makes really great use of materials like steel, concrete, and land. A nuclear power plant like the one we're building in Wyoming that will generate up to 500 megawatts of electricity during the day will only occupy about 60 acres. If you compared that to a solar field, which we need lots more solar, but a solar field of that size would occupy thousands of acres. So nuclear is all about density. And that's important as we look at the next 100 years because we want to make good use of materials. We also want to make good use of land, which is even scarce in some areas. In Virginia, for example, they're seeing tremendous electricity demand growth driven by data center activity there. But Virginia is an agricultural state. They don't have an unlimited amount of land to develop solar and wind projects. So nuclear is really a great option for them, especially now with all of these big changes, these big stresses on our energy system, right? We're going to decarbonize. We're going to grow the total demand. We also have some geopolitical instability that we've really, realized since the Russians invaded Ukraine. That means we need to think of energy at systems level. We shouldn't be kind of competing one source against another. We have to think about what's the optimum mix. And, when we look at nuclear and we look at, the objective of achieving a carbon-free grid, study after study is now showing that nuclear should be 20 to 30% of that grid.